All rise. We will wait. Please be seated. We will.
Thank you very much. Ruto, I see you have your babe back on.
Yes, Mr. President, I do apologize. I actually put it on during the break. It was just on a mission.
We
Sorry.
just wanted to let you know that you will have the right or privilege of asking this witness some questions when it's your turn, if need be.
Thank you, Mr. President,
So
Your Honors.
we need not do so now, just letting you know.
Yes, just a bit of a difficulty in the sense that I had now again planned to leave tonight.
It's up to you. We're telling you if you want to.
Yes, but I will make arrangements so that we can see between Mr. Naransetseg and I what we could do. Thank you.
Please proceed.
Mr. Garcia, good afternoon. Mr. Witness. Witness, good afternoon. Question. Mr. Witness, I would like to follow up on the last question that the chamber asked you about the origins of the ODM party. Can you briefly tell us about the referendum of 2005 and the link, if any, between that referendum and the members of the ODM party in 2007? Answer very clearly, ODM stemmed from the constitutional referendum of 2005, and the no vote won by 58%, and this was unexpected. Question. I'm sorry to interrupt, but what were the stakes of the referendum? Answer. Maybe we can explain why the no vote won. What were the tensions? It happened in relation to a constitution that had been negotiated over a long period by many segments of the civil society in the Bomas of Kenya. And the text was reviewed and amended by the government in a manner that did not correspond with the spirit of the original document. So it was those changes that were rejected. What specifically was rejected? To begin with, the fact that the post of Prime Minister would be a non-executive post. And secondly, the executive would have sweeping powers, just like in the 63 system. It is true that decentralization was envisaged, but it was limited. What caused problems for the Christian churches was the fact that Sharia law would continue to apply to Muslims in the area of family law and others. Question. Thank you, Mr. Witness. I would like to ask you to slow down a little bit, and I will also slow down, and we will pause for 5 seconds. You talked about the referendum and the stakes. Now, who were those who were in support of that constitutional document, and who were those against? Answer. Amongst the no voters, you had civil society leaders, and you also had those who were later to become members of the ODM, that is the Leadership Commission of the ODM, which was known as the Pentagon. Maybe we will revisit that later. But outside of ODM, there was the particular case of Uhuru Kenyatta, and a good proportion of the members of the KANU party who were some of the strongest supporters of the no vote. Question, you have mentioned the members of the Pentagon of the ODM. Who were the members of the ODM who at that time were against the proposed constitutional reform text? Answer, you want to know who were the leaders of the Pentagon who voted no? Well, the leadership of the ODM was broadly made up as follows. You had leaders, regional leaders. In the Rift Valley, you had William Ruto, you had Mudavadi for the Luyas, you had Charity Ngilu for the Kambas, you had Nyaga for the Embus. And that is the Embus and the Gemas. And the Gema stands for Kikuyu, Embu, Meru. That is the ethnic groups of the Central Province. Now, according to Sebastian Inisher, who is a specialist of political parties in Kenya and who has just published a book on that, Uhuru Kenyatta was originally a member of the Pentagon for the Central Province, and then from the coast you had Najib Balala, and I believe that is it. Question, very well, if I understand you correctly, these were the leaders who were against the constitution proposed during the referendum. Now, which was the government in power which had proposed that constitutional reform at the time? Answer, this was a sort of coalition government, because we have to go back to the elections of 2002. It was the NAC camp which won the elections, and it was a very peculiar alliance which was improvised rather hastily. Kibaki had gathered together a pool of financial leaders, and they were able to gather together a lot of money. And this meant that in 2007 they brought to them candidates who no longer had any campaign funds, including Wamalwa and Charity Ngilu. So they created NAC. As from the end of 2002, when Uhuru Kenyatta was nominated as the KANU candidate, many political bigwigs from KANU joined the Kibaki camp to attempt to revive their careers, and so the Kibaki party was negotiated on the basis of an agreement which formed the foundation of the government as from 2002, except that Kibaki did not respect the provisions of that agreement. So over a period of 5 years, you had tensions, and this led to the referendum campaign, which led to a clearly defined position for the two camps. Question, you briefly mentioned the results of the referendum, which means that the proposed document was rejected. Is that correct? Yes, it was rejected. Maybe I should explain. Apart from the precise stakes, I should like to add that if so many people rejected that text, it is because many of the communities expressed their frustration relating to the unfair distribution of resources. This meant that the sub-communities voted heavily against the text. Question. Let me stop you there. Can you briefly tell us which were the ethnic groups that for the majority voted in favor of the text, and those which rejected it. Was there a difference amongst the ethnic groups, and if so, why? Answer. As far as I remember, it was only Central Province which returned a majority vote in favor, and then there were two other provinces with slim victory margins in favor of the Constitution. So the result was absolutely clear. What was new was that that document was rejected also by groups which so far had been split between the opposition and the government. At one time, the leaders of those communities had advocated a yes vote. There were some of those community leaders who had called for the members of their communities to vote in favor of the Constitution. But those people did not heed the call. So in the final analysis, the vote was individual. The opinion of the leaders really did not count. So there was an opportunity, and people wanted to take advantage of that opportunity, and after that there would be an electoral campaign over a period of 2 years. So that was a very special situation. Question: you have mentioned swing communities on several occasions. What communities are you referring to? Answer: as you know, in order to win elections in Kenya, you have to necessarily win those swing communities, and those are specifically the Kambas, the Luyas, and the Kisis. Question: you have mentioned that there were leaders of those swing communities. Do you have names for us? Answer: those who called for a yes vote included Vice President Awori for the Luyas, Charity Ngilu for the Kambas, and Simeon Nyachai for the Kisis. Question: regarding those who belonged to the Kalenjin ethnic group, were they in any one of the two camps? Please pause for a while and then give us your answer. Answer: in the Rift Valley and amongst the Kalenjins, the political class were unanimous against that constitution. As far as I can remember, President Moi and his camp had called for a vote against that constitution. And there were other young people, including William Ruto and others, who were amongst the leaders of the No campaign. Question: just to follow up, Mr. Witness, to be clear, what specifically, who specifically was Moi at that time? What did he represent? Answer: this was someone who had been president from 1978 to 2002, and he left his stamp on the state. So you want to know what influence he still had in the Rift Valley. Well, at that time, it was difficult to gauge his influence because there were primary elections that gave indications of what was happening, and also elections inside the KANU party. And there were indications that Moi was losing ground, and there was a new generation of Kalenjin politicians who had prepared the after Moi era. So there were politicians from the Kalenjin subgroups, including the Nandis and the Kipsigis, who progressively were able to make their majority count, because those two groups are the largest groups amongst the Kalenjin groups. And we must point out that the Kalenjin constitutes a very recent identity that was invented in the 40s and 50s. Question. We will revisit this later, but thank you for the answer. One point of clarification. You said that both Moy and William Ruto were opposed to the proposed constitutional text. Did you carry out any research on this issue? Amongst the Kalenjin people, what was their vision on the proposed text? Why did they reject the reformed constitution? Answer. They rejected a form of decentralization that was not consistent with their point of view. They wanted to defend a notion of advanced decentralization, which is usually referred to in Kenya as Majimbo. And Majimbo stems from the end of the 50s, early 60s, and it was Kadu which partially developed this notion of Majimbo. Now, in relation to the ODM campaign in 2007, Majimbo was at the heart of that campaign, but that notion of Majimbo did not represent the same thing for the various communities. Question. Thank you. We are going to come back to the ODM itself, but let us dwell on the referendum campaign. You have said that decentralization was a crucial point for the Kalenjins. Can you explain to us why they rejected that constitution? Why did Moy and the others appeal to the voters to reject it?
Sorry, you can answer that question, but what is Kadu? Can you explain this on the record?
Alors, Kadu.
Kadu, I really do not remember precisely, but it should be something like Kenya African Democratic Union. The term Kadu was used quite frequently in the same way as KANU was used later. This was a party that operated until 1964, and the elite of Kadu integrated themselves into the new party, which was KANU. But there was also another smaller party, the KPU.
So the prosecutor's question about why the Kalenjins rejected the constitution in light of their concerns about decentralization.
Alors, à l'évidence, il y a
Answer. To all intents and purposes, there is the land issue that has to be scrutinized in detail, but very clearly the fact was that the Kalenjins wanted to revive the customary law over what they considered as their land. They wanted access to land to be reserved to certain groups, and this would be done through a form of decentralization. So Majimbo involved land tenure rights for the indigents or natives, and different laws for the outsiders. That is, the people who arrived in the Rift Valley either between the wars or in the 60s and 70s. It will be necessary to explain under what circumstances, because this is at the heart of the land tenure issue in this area. Question. Thank you for that clarification, Mr. Witness. But once again, on this issue, you have mentioned the Rift Valley, and it is expected that the natives or indigenes in this area were the Kalenjins. Now, regarding the outsiders who settled between the two wars, which specifically were these people, which ethnic group? Answer, we have to refer to the background, but broadly speaking, the Rift Valley was known as the White Highlands, and up until the end of the 50s, land ownership was reserved for the whites ever since 1904. So they needed workers, and between the wars, they brought in a lot of people, a lot of workers. They did not recruit people from the Rift Valley who were perceived as farmers, pastoralists, but they brought in people from reservations, from areas that were demographically saturated, and this included many Kikuyus. So there were many Kikuyus employed in the area, but there were also Luyas, Kisis, and Luos. But basically, what is known today as outsider refers to the people who arrived within the framework of the resettlement of the Rift Valley after the Rift Valley. In the Rift Valley, because most of those White Highlands were bought by the government, which initiated the settlement schemes, and there was a second form of distribution of those lands in the form of land buying companies.
And
that was a somewhat different phenomenon for political reasons. Question, indeed, we will touch upon that point when we review the causes for the post-electoral violence. Now, for the time being, I'd like to finish off with this particular issue of the 2005 referendum. You said that the draft constitution was rejected, and what were the consequences of this draft constitution being rejected? In your report, can 0TP 00930871, if you turn to page 880, the witness, 0880, the last four numbers. Second paragraph, you said something about the eviction of, can you find that particular point? You said 2005, all the ministers who were going to vote for the Constitution, and this led to only an elite remaining. Now, this relates to the 2005 draft Constitution. Answer, when that draft Constitution was rejected, the coalition broke up, and Kibaki, who received a non-confidence vote by way of this referendum, had to step down. And you see the voter basis, foundation was quite restricted of this politician. Now, he needed to keep a majority in Parliament, and he wanted to cling to some legitimacy. There were attempts to drive him out, and these attempts were made by various political camps with a view to creating a proper political foundation that would be operational. And so the government with the largest, the party with the largest number of ministers that could bring as many people around it, you see, he tried to bring people together from the group that had dropped him. He redistributed the positions to various people with this group, and he thought he would be able to win their support that way. So once again, a new political balance had been struck. He had cobbled a new group of ministers together. And now this led to a great deal of frustration amongst the elite who had lost their positions and within a certain community.
Questions, but I was waiting for a good place to put them. But the more you move, the more questions arise. And it may be better to pose those questions at a point when the witness is speaking about them. So, if I may do so. Witness, you had said that Mr. Moy, the former president, had called for a no vote during the referendum. In your view, are you in a position to assess to what extent he was listened to, especially among the Kalenjins at the time, when he called for a no vote to the referendum, or in the referendum?
The witness. Of course. Well, it's very difficult to determine which leader influenced the Kalenjins in 2007 when they rejected the draft constitution. Correction, 2005. Did this come from Ruto's camp or another camp? In 2005, of course, the issue really was not being brought up. But if we look at this matter in retrospect, we see that this message, this refusal of the draft constitution, was so intentional on the part of the Kalenjin that the political leaders had to follow suit. And in retrospect, we realize that, well, which leader emerged from the referendum? It wasn't Arap Moy, it was not Biwats, it was not, well, it wasn't from the team that led beforehand. It was the new politicians, William Ruto, and all the politicians who came in, this new generation of politicians. And we realized that the referendum was the beginning of the new hegemony of the Kalenjin community, of William Ruto and his team. This was confirmed in the following year during a statement made by Alvada Mine. William Ruto was deemed to be the spokesperson of the Kalenjin community, and this was in the presence of several Kalenjin MPs. So the winner, I think, was William Ruto, far more than Daniel. When we look at these events after the fact, in 2007, you see,
get this testimony clear. Part of the answer that we were fed through translation says this, that looking at this matter in retrospect, someone had highlighted my transcript in purple, and I can't. All right, thank you, whoever did that. I'll take that again. You said, looking at this matter in retrospect, we see that this message, this refusal of the draft constitution was so intentional on the part of the Kalenjin that the political leaders had to follow suit. Can you please explain what you're saying there briefly?
The witness, well, what I mean is that the leaders don't necessarily always have the power that they take on for themselves. Often leaders are obliged to say to the people what they want to hear. And in actual fact, the Kalenjin did not want to hear anything except a refusal of the draft constitution, because they apparently were quite unanimous within the community regarding this message about Majimbo. And we saw this in particular in 2007 at the time of the violence. We saw that the lower level notables or community leaders, we saw this amongst the armed groups. And this was quite strongly rooted within the population. This need to regain this entitlement over the land. The politicians on certain issues must say such things. They most likely believe in it. But this was a message that they really had to transmit. Those who countered that message would pay the price. In 2007 and 2008, you must remember that some properties of Daniel Lamoy were destroyed. The property of several Kalenjin leaders who hadn't been very virulent in their defense of Majimbo, that property was also destroyed, their farms razed to the ground. You see, there was violence within the community as well, and the people do have their ways of putting pressure on the leaders themselves.
You had also said that Majimbo represented a system of decentralization that meant different laws for those considered to be outsiders. Was that what you said, and what do you mean by that?
Alors, en fait, ce qui était...
Answer, in actual fact, well, it was more in the constitutional draft of 2007 that was brought forward. There was decentralization, and the no side wanted a form of federalism. In particular, people in the Rift Valley wanted a form of federalism that would regularize access to land, and this regulation would be handled by local authorities. Majimbo, the Luo version thereof, was more a form of conventional federalism versus the Kalenjin version. You see, it had to do with land tenure, and it revolved around their interpretation of Majimbo.
So, different people might have been using the term Majimbo, but it meant different things to different people. Is that it?
Tout à fait.
Answer, exactly. Some people in some communities had one meaning, other people had other meanings for that word. The Ruto converted to this particular ideology later on in the year 2000 and thereafter. And you see progressively the Kalenjin concept of Majimbo gained traction. And you see, if it had not been for the violence in 2008, there were some strategies on the part of local community leaders quite similar to Majimbo practices of the Kalenjin variety. Was it just a reaction to the Kalenjin's attacks, or was it that the Luo people in that area thought we had to find some form of autonomy that would allow the natives to have land tenure in a particular area? Very difficult to say, but what we can confirm is that at the level of the national elites, the Luo elites never developed the ideas of Majimbo the way that the Kalenjin did as of the 1990s through multiple speeches, multiple forms of rhetoric within the Rift Valley.
And what was the Kalenjin version of Majimbo versus another group's version of Majimbo? I believe you had said that the Luo had in mind a conventional form of federalism. Can you explain what was different? Kalenjin version versus other people's versions.
Je dirais que
Answer. I would say that in the Luo version, land tenure was of little importance because, you see, other groups were not envying them for their land. As for the Kalenjins, that was the central issue, land ownership, land tenure for decades, a century indeed. They had seen various people arriving and taking land. So what I mean by that is, for them, access to land and land ownership had to be regulated by the community of origin. It didn't mean that land ownership would be forbidden, that non-Kalenjin people couldn't own land or other groups couldn't own land. They were saying that there had to be some higher rights granted to native people who were native to the area, or greater entitlements. So that led to a vision of two-tier citizenship. They were in favor of two tiers of citizenship, with this distinction between people who were native to a region and then people who were not native to a region. This notion was developed in various speeches during political rallies and expanded. And this began in the 1990s, not just amongst the Kalenjin community, also amongst Maasai politicians. In short, it was relatively common. This was common rhetoric in the Rift Valley. The Rift Valley is inhabited by other groups, other political elites that also were part of this debate and have been part of this debate for 20 years.
And on that subject, land ownership, you had testified that the Rift Valley was known as the White Highlands. And in that sense, you meant that it was reserved for white settlers. You testified to that. What do we mean by reserved for white settlers? Do we mean expropriation without compensation?
Huh?
Can you please explain?
Alors, il faut peut-être que
Answer. Well, perhaps we should review the history of land ownership within the Rift Valley, which is a complex issue. Why has there been violence in that part of the world? Because the history of land ownership in that area is quite unique, and there have been various institutions. The land tenure institutions are quite unique in comparison to the coast, for example. In other parts of Kenya, the land ownership system is different, and this is because of history. I could briefly review this very special history of the Rift Valley. Late in the 19th century, the British arrived in the country and quickly occupied the Rift Valley. In 1904, the richest...
We'll continue, but
Okay.
let's make something clear. When you say arrived, and the reason I say this is when I was asking you the question before, you were saying we and nodding. I don't know whether that came onto the transcript, but You've also now talked about arriving and not quickly taking the land. My point was it expropriation without compensation?
Ah oui. Ah oui, les populations.
Oh, yes. The people who were there in that area were thrown out. Their customary rights were done away with, extinguished, and all the land, well, the legal status of the land changed. It became crown land, and it belonged to the state. The land belonged to the state, and the state redistributed the land to white farmers. Up until the late 1950s, only white people were able to purchase land in that region.
Il n'y a eu aucune.
And there was no compensation provided to the people who were operating in that area. I have to explain to you, you see, that this area, or these areas, the native populations were pastoralists. So their concept of land ownership was quite broad. So you see, an area of land might appear to be empty, but actually the land was being used by these people. So late 19th century, early 20th century, there was a social demographic crisis, a serious one within the region and within the whole, really with this, late in the 19th century, there were a series of famines, and in Kenya, entire populations lost 1/3 or 1/2 of their numbers. Once the British arrived, they had the impression that they had stumbled upon an empty land. But you see, it was just a very unusual set of circumstances that gave that impression, because there had been these events, these famines, and so on. The Rift Valley appeared to be empty, but it was not. And so these local populations were thrown out. The Maasai, certain Maasai groups within the Rift Valley were at the other end of the territory. And then the Kalenjin and other Maasai groups were concentrated in small areas, which were too small in comparison to their usual way of life. They were pastoralists. And so they found themselves on the fringes of the White Highlands. And so, yes, of course, this is why there's this feeling of historical injustice.
That's what we're trying to understand, and why, whether or not one can understand the unique perception or the unique definition of, or understanding of Majimbo in that particular area. Now, fast forward, you also talked about various people arriving and taking land. I'm quoting from what you testified to earlier. Apart from the colonialists at the time, do we mean anything else when you say, do you mean anything else when you say various people arriving and taking land?
Answer. During the colonial period.
Oui. Non.
During that period, no.
No, I meant apart from the colonial era. Did other people also take land after the colonial period in the area in a manner that might explain the unique understanding of Majimboism that the Kalenjins had?
Oui, bien sûr.
Answer, yes, of course. You can't understand the whole issue of land tenure within the Rift Valley unless you consider the history after independence. I can expand upon that briefly. After independence, most of the white land was bought back by the Kenyan government using monies provided by the English government. Then, we came to a crucial moment in history, and the issue was, what are we going to do with this land? At that juncture, there was a division within the political scheme. On the one side, we had the Kadu party, which was a gathering of small ethnic groups, and the Kalenjin, they asked to be given back their ancestral entitlements to that land and to have a federal system. That's the origin of Majimbo. On the other side of this political divide, you had Jomo Kenyatta and his party. He, in contrast, called not for federalism, but rather for a centralized state, and he said, no, the customary rights have been extinguished for once and for all, and the land purchased by the government will be redistributed by the government on a national basis. Thus, you must realize in 1963 the elections were quite clear. Kadu won by a broad majority, and so the decision was made, and the decision was Kanu. So a centralized state, redistribution of land in the Rift Valley by the state. And that was done to the detriment of the Kalenjin, but they swallowed this bitter pill. And later, the Kalenjin elite had access to this particular solution for various reasons. The Kalenjin elites took advantage of some redistribution of land and certain positions. For example, vice president given to Daniel Arap Moi, and he was able to lessen the frustration. Thus, they swallowed this bitter pill. The Trans-Nzoia area was put in the western part, and for most of the Kalenjin. But you see, at the same time, Luya and Kalenjin elites received large settlements. At the time of the independence, when 3 to 4 million hectares of land was being redistributed, half the land was redistributed to small farmers. The other half was either redistributed in the form of large properties, sometimes even more than 500,000 hectares, and they were distributed to the elite. And that was used to settle down these elites who were somewhat worked up. Maybe this is a cynical reading, but there you have it. That was the situation. The dismantling of the white lands and the Rift Valley in 1963, the fact that one area went to the west and some areas that were quite rich went to Nyanza, which was a Luo province. This dismantling or carving up of the Rift Valley was not at all appreciated by the Kalenjin elites. And they couldn't help. They called out. They thought it was scandalous. Within the Kandalin elite and within Moi's regime, there were people within this elite who spoke out, who expressed this message of frustration from the grassroots, but they paid a heavy price. On the Kenyatta government, there was one leader, Jean-Marie Lorenzi, who was one of the Kalenjin leaders who complained bitterly, who said, this is a Kikuyu colonialization. And he said so, and he spent 2 years in prison for that statement, and his political career was in ruins thereafter. And so you see a whole series of Kalenjin politicians found themselves off on the sidelines. If they dared to express these claims, this frustration, about the arrival of these other peoples. And this was as of 1963.
What's the name for the record? There was a name, somebody you mentioned, just so that the court reporters can type it. Did you mention the name of the gentleman?
Jean-Marie.
Sir? Jean-Marie Soroniy. S-E-R-O-N-I-Y.
Thank you. Mr. Garcia, please.
Mr. President, could I just put that on record? The name of the person being referred to.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, Mr. President, the first name is Jean, Jean, Soroniy is S-E-R-O-N-E-Y.
Thank you. Please proceed, Mr. Garcia.
Alors, juste. Pour l'orthographe, ça dépend des transcriptions et des auteurs et des bouquins.
The witness, well, the actual spelling of the name, it depends on the transcription of the name, and various authors spell it in different ways.
Fair enough. I think that's noted. The point is made. Okay. Please proceed, Mr. Garcia.
Alors, Monsieur le témoin, je veux simplement vous...
Question, Mr. Witness. You were talking about the consequences of the rejection of the referendum text, and you said that Mr. Kibaki evicted from the government certain people who had opposed him. And to which parties did these people belong to? Answer, these were mostly Luos and Kalenjins. Yes, indeed. Question, was there a reaction from those people and their communities, that is, to the fact that people from their ethnic groups had been evicted? And this is difficult to say. It was an electoral campaign, and those who had called for a no vote knew very well that they were going into another era of politics. So they were campaigning to defeat Kibaki in the elections, so they did not expect to be part of the leadership. They expressed their frustrations through the electoral campaign. And to all intents and purposes, yes, this led to frustrations. Were these frustrations expressed later during the violence of 2008? That is what some analysts say. But we can say that this is subjective. It is not something that can be clearly established. Question, Mr. Witness. You also started talking about the political platform of the ODM at the time of the elections in 2007. What was this political platform? Answer. Certain specialists. There is a German who has published something in this nature. He says that the manifesto of the ODM was not very programmatic. But I have my doubts because this manifesto was well understood. A German who has published. Even if this information was concealed within the framework of ethnic clashes. But when you read some of those articles, they provide some information on the number of victims and other subjects. So the information was communicated somehow. Is outside of the international community, or rather the diplomatic community, particularly because they did not fully understand what was happening.
And you also say that there was the Akiwumi that would have retrospectively reported on those events. Is that the case? If that is, are there any other reports apart from the Akiwumi reports that you would say would happen a formal commission of inquiry that captured these events and recorded them, even if that was done much, much later after the fact? A formal commission of inquiry that captured these events and recorded them.
Particular subject, and this is used to appease people because they are told to allow the commission to work, and if the results of the commission report are not very favorable, reports are frequently not published or published with long delays. One cannot say that in Kenya this was totally unknown. Some information was at least disclosed.
So I guess here, please proceed. We have 2 more minutes for. Is it 4 minutes?
2 minutes, Your Honor. I see 2 minutes. Just to read into the record, Your Honor, I see that we haven't spelled out Akiwumi. Just for the record, it's AKIWMI. So it's at line, page 63, line 5, and page before that as well. I'd like to break at this point. Tomorrow morning I'll be starting a new line of questions for the witness.
Indeed. 1 second, please. How are we doing with our lineup of the remainder of the session?
I'll hand the floor to Mr. Steinberg, who will be explaining to the court what is the situation at present.
Your Honor, would it be possible to do this in private session, please?
Indeed, we'll do that in private session. So we will excuse the witness and go briefly into private session. Witness, we have come to the end of today's session. You will rejoin us tomorrow at 9:30. Thank you. You will rejoin us tomorrow at 9:30. Thank you.